Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me and this special video which is a care collaboration about slipper orchids. And it has been arranged by the wonderful Nina of Ninja Orchids, who's based in Spain. So a million thanks for including me in this care collaboration video with growers from all over the world, which is so exciting to see. Now, if you're new to my channel, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without any greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers, just me and them either inside or outside or not at all. So this care collab is going to be interesting because there'll be people growing this type of orchids in many different conditions. So hopefully you will find something that resonates with you and that works for your climate. And without further ado, let me share with you who else is participating in this global slipper orchid collaboration. They are the Orchid Saga, Fernanda Nascimento Orchids and Succulents, Matt by Nature, Trish's Orchid Life, Karen's Orchids, Hillbilly Orchids, Ed's Orchids, and we all know Ed is the king of paphs and frags. Tropical Plants Finland, Simply Orchids, etc., Orchids by the Lake, Mary G Orchids and More, Beauty of Orchids and Plants, DD Blooms, Danielle's Orchid Ranch, The Right Path, this is the video for that, Joyous Orchids, and Toiki World. There we go. I think we've probably got every geographical region covered. So it will be very interesting to watch everyone else's video. I'll put all the links below for everyone else's channel. So do go and have a look and figure out what might work for you in your climate. So talking of such things, let me give you an idea of my climate if you're new to me and to my channel, and you might not well know what Melbourne's climate is. Australia is a very large landmass and there is a myriad of different climatic zones within Australia. And for our North American viewers, Australia doesn't have climatic zones as you do in the States, nor do they have in Britain, because the issue with Australia is heat and rainfall rather than cold. So we don't really have that same kind of zonal system, so it can make it a little harder perhaps for American viewers to understand quite what our climate is. However, Melbourne is in southern Australia, and our climate is either described as a warm temperate or a wet Mediterranean. So in effect, we have cool, wet winters and hottish, dry summers. Summers often aren't that dry, and our winters don't get to freezing here in Melbourne in the city centre. So our climate is probably more akin to Mediterranean zones. So certainly the Mediterranean basin, parts of South Africa, New Zealand, parts of California, and certain other parts of the States have a similar temperature range to us. But also, a lot of gardeners can grow the same plants in Australia that you can grow in Ireland, for example, and in southern Britain. So it's kind of a blurred climatic map. But what I do is grow a lot of orchids outside all year under cover, so they're protected from the rain, but they do get our winter nighttime minimums, which can get to around 3 to 4 degrees centigrade. So that is the high 30s, low 40s Fahrenheit. And part of my shtick is that I don't have a greenhouse and I don't heat anything. So really, orchids for me have either got to be able to live inside in the same conditions as me or outside and deal with the cool winter nighttime minimums. So that is my parameter. Let's define our terms, as every good high school debater would inform you. You should do first. Slipper orchids, just what are they? Slipper orchid is a common name, and it is used to describe a group of orchids that allegedly look like slippers. I've never really seen the whole slipper thing myself anyway. That's where the common name comes from. But there are sort of three main groups that are commonly called slipper orchids, and they are Paphiopedilum. This is a great example because it's flowering right now, but we'll get to this. Phragmipedium, which is a plant with very similar flower, but a different geographic zone. We'll get to that. And Cypripedium, which now I know this does not look like a healthy example. This is a care collab, Matthew, not a death collab, but we'll get to that as well. And these are a terrestrial type, which are found across the Northern Hemisphere. So those are the three key types of slipper orchid. And as I just alluded, the Cypripedium is a Northern Hemisphere species. We don't get any of those in the Southern Hemisphere. The Phragmipediums are all New World, so they are Southern American natives. And the Paphiopedilums are all Asiatic. So they grow from the Himalayan region all the way through Southeast Asia. And I think some species are found across in the Pacific Islands as well. So that's the range of paphs. So as you can imagine, vast range of geography, which means a vast range of care. So I guess within those three groups of orchids, we can then split them up into species types, and that means the orchid is as it's found in the wild, and then hybrids, and the hybrids have been hybridized to cross various species and then crossing various hybrids to produce particular flower colors, temperature tolerance, sometimes fragrance in blooms, and multiple blooming times. So a hybrid orchid tends to have, well, we could say generally simpler, more generic care than its species, because the species plants would have evolved for a particular niche in the environment, whether it's high altitude, low altitude, near a stream, on limestone cliffs, in shady deciduous forests, getting salt spray, who knows? There's a million different niches that orchids can evolve to fit. So hybrids are generally a little easier to manage because their care is a bit more generic. So what I've got here is a whole bunch of hybrids. I do have a couple of species, but let's elide over those and let's just focus on the hybrids. And plant lovers, it is very good timing because not only is this one in bloom, but I was also very fortunate 2 weekends ago to go and visit an amazing grower here in Melbourne who is a member of several orchid groups that I belong to. And he took me through his grow houses, which are quite incredible. I'm hoping that he'll agree to make a video with me, so watch this space for that. But he very kindly showed me through his space. He's got, I think, 6 different orchid houses on his property, and each one slightly different climatic conditions. But what interested me most, plant lovers, was where he was growing his Paphiopedilums and his Phragmipediums, because they were essentially in the same space, and this you're not going to believe, they were basically in the same conditions as his Cattleyas. Now, what everyone will tell you about slipper orchids, so Paphiopedium, Phragmipedium, is that they are a low light orchid. So, first rule, let's maybe just burst that bubble. I am not convinced that they are the low light orchid that we all thought they were. Obviously, there's a range of natural habitats for the species. A lot of them are terrestrial, so they're understory plants, but a lot of them do grow in the edge of rocky formations. A lot of Phragmipediums grow by streams, and they're the sort of areas that do get stronger light than deep in the forest. So it's not a given, but a lot of them are going to get quite strong dappled light. They might get seasonal lights. If the sun is lower in winter, you might get more penetration, or higher in summer, etc., etc. So I think, and what I have learned from my visit to Michael, is that they are not perhaps the low light orchid that we all thought they should be. And on the shelf behind me over here is where I have been growing a lot of my Paphiopedilums. Now, I have decided in my infinite wisdom to move them somewhere where they're getting brighter indirect light, the same kind of light that you're given on Oncidium. And the first sort of proof of that pudding is this fabulous plant here. So let's talk about this one. This is Paphiopedilum, and it is called Duo de Citron. And I have made many a video about this because, which is the whole point of this video, it's a bit of a learning curve, learning how to grow these orchids. So the first thing is that this one is sequential. So you get one bloom and then a bud appears, then a second and a third and a fourth, sometimes a fifth, and then the whole flower spike will die down. Now, there are some sequential bloomers like Cypripedium orchids where that flower spike can actually last for years. In the case of this one, it won't. It will last about 6 months, and you maybe get 4 to 5, if you're lucky, 6 sequential blooms, and then the whole spike will die down, and then you can cut it. So that's the first thing to remember. There are several sequential bloomers that have been hybridized, and there are also types of Phragmipedium and Paphiopedilum that have multiple blooms at the same time. So it's always good to know what you've got, and don't cut the flower spike until you're sure that it's dead. Now, this one, as you can see, has got slightly mottled leaves, and another sort of I guess piece of information you often hear is that the mottled leaved plants like this one prefer lower light to the more glossy leaved plants like this one. Well, yes, possibly, but back to the light situation. This plant, for me, I decided to move into a brighter indirect spot about 6 months ago. So it got really bright indirect winter light, still indoors all year, not outdoors. And it rewarded me pretty quickly with a flower bud. And that was 2 years after it had flowered previously. The whole notion of how often these plants rebloom is a bit up in the air as far as I'm concerned. This one for me has flowered in a 2-year cycle twice. I also know someone else who has this plant and it also flowers every 2 years for them. However, some hybrids of Paphiopedilum will flower every year, and I've even read of plants blooming multiply in a year. So I guess it depends on the hybrid and the parents and what qualities that hybrid has been bred for. But this one only blooms every 2 years. So it's quite a laborious process. However, you get 6 months worth of flowers and they are incredible. Look at that lemon yellow, hence the name, that incredible colored flower. It's really amazing. So good bang for buck. So I would suggest if you can get hold of a sequential bloomer, do get yourself one. Look at that, isn't it fabulous? Slightly green, but also an incredibly rich yellow to those flowers. So basic Paphiopedilum care then, I would say bright indirect light. So perhaps not as low light as you think. I would give it the same kind of light as an Oncidium. If the leaves start to get a little bit patchy, i.e. little brown circles, it means you're giving it too much light and pull it back. But don't put it in a shady dark corner because it's probably not going to bloom for you. The other thing about Paphiopedilums is, of course, that they don't have pseudobulbs, so it means that it doesn't have the capacity to store water, which means you've got to water it relatively frequently and not allow the medium to dry out. Asterix, it does not want to have soggy, wet medium all the time and soggy roots because they will rot, and I've experienced that myself. So you've got to find that happy medium, and that will really depend on your conditions, your ambient temperature, and how quickly your medium dries out. But it's not a bad idea when you water them just to have a little residue in the dish, not swimming, but just that the dish looks damp, and then water it whenever you feel it needs watering again. And a good rule of thumb, maybe just try and get your finger into the top of the medium and just see how far down you go till you feel that it's moist. Otherwise, the weight of the pot is always a good indicator. So there's no real rule about how often you should water them. Obviously more in warm weather, less in cooler weather, certainly less in winter, depends where you are. Just don't keep the roots wet and soggy, particularly in cold weather. That won't end well. But maybe every sort of 2 to 3-ish days in really warm weather, and then maybe every 6, 7 to 10 days in winter. It really depends where you are. So you just got to figure out what works for you and them. Then food-wise, I give mine a topical dose of a slow-release fertilizer in spring, and I give all my plants that. It's a 6-month slow-release general fertilizer, and that is heat-released, by the way. So if you get incredibly warm weather, it can go and release everything. So it might not last 6 months, something to bear in mind. And then during the growing year, the growing cycle, I will give it a liquid fertilizer of either an orchid-based fertilizer or a liquid general fertilizer, or something that's seaweed-based, which is a tonic, or worm juice, for example, which is also a tonic. And I mix it all up. I mean, not literally together, but I alternate so that you're not feeding the plant the same thing all the time. Because a little like us, I think it might get bored and its digestive juices might prefer a bit of a shake-up. So there we go, Paphiopedilum, basic care, light, water, food, and temperature-wise, yes, depends on the hybrid, but they can take relatively cool temperatures. I did experiment growing one of mine outdoors all year, undercover. It didn't thrive, I would say, and I bought 2 seedlings at the same time. One of them, which I kept indoors, flourished, flowered. The other grew, but didn't flourish and didn't flower. So I think maybe 10 degrees centigrade, sort of 50-ish degrees Fahrenheit is probably the minimum you'd want to go to with these orchids if that's your outdoor temperature. If you go lower than that, which I do in winter, maybe they're an indoor plant, or it's half-half. You do summer outside, winter inside, like the best of us. Now, the other point, I guess, to bear in mind is what the flowers look like when they're budding, because that is often an interesting question. So I don't know if you can see here, but this, plant lovers, is a flower bud. And if you hold it up to the light, you can literally see the outline of the flower in there. And I'll try and photograph that for you. I think you can see it there, actually. You can see the outline of the bud. So it looks different to a leaf as it's coming out. I'm filming this in its early autumn in Australia. And I don't think there is rhyme or reason. I think it can really depend on what the species ancestors were, what the conditions are, the temperature, how the plant's feeling. Obviously, this one started to bloom for me in spring and it's now getting towards autumn, and this will be the last flower. So I've basically had a spring summer cycle of blooming from this one, and this one, the flower spike is appearing in autumn and it will probably mature and open in winter. So there you go, pretty mixed bag. And that one that's in bloom, if you're interested, is a mix of whisky, is a hybrid cross between whisky snow cloud and spicerianum. And I think it's a form called turban. And spicerianum is a species orchid which is Himalayan and can take cool temperatures, cool nighttime minimums. And I have been growing this one outdoors all year. Undercover, it's getting quite bright morning sun and then dappled in direct light. And as you can see, it's grown for me 2 fans. So those kind of the growth points of this type of orchid are called fans, and I've got 2, and one of them has decided to bloom. And I bought this as a seedling maybe 2 years ago. So relatively fast from seedling to bloom for some of them. And from a sort of a growth cycle perspective, so you have the fan and the fan will produce the flower for you. So obviously you want to grow another fan because that's going to be the flowering point for the next year or 2 years, depending on your cycle. And I'll try and come in and show you closely, but in here on Duo de Citron, right in there, we can see a little green point, and that is the new fan that's just started to emerge. So with this plant, I know that it's going to take 2 years for that to mature and bloom. And I'm here to say that generally, from my experience, this group of orchids, they are pretty slow growers, so you've got to have patience. I'm quite amazed that this one appears to have a flower bud when I'd say that seedling is maybe in its 4th year. That seems, I bought it maybe 2 years ago. It was probably relatively established when I bought it. There you go. Anyway, I'm surprised at the speed of that one, but generally they are slow growers. I also really like to understand what the names mean. So we've got 3 types of orchids, similar sound. So the pedilum bit of all of these orchids is derived from the Greek, which means slipper or shoe, hence the slipper orchid bit. And then the Paph of Paphiopedilum refers to Paphos, which means a city with a temple. But in fact, I spent my childhood in Cyprus, and Paphos is a place in Cyprus. So there you go. The frag of Phragmipedium is referring, well, it means fence, literally, and that refers to one of the structures of the flower itself, and that it's separated. Beyond me, it's very botanical, not that interested. And the sip of the Cypripedium is drawn from the word for Venus, Aphrodite. Again, grew up in Cyprus, Aphrodite's Isle, and that's where the sip prefix of that orchid comes from. Okay, so let's move on. Phragmipedium, this one I have here is a seedling of Fritz Schomburg, which is quite a famous type. Now, frags are a little trickier than Paphs, and Ed's Orchids, who is part of this collaboration, really is the king, and he's the one to watch because he's a brilliant grower of them. So essentially these often grow by streams, and they do tend to all like alkaline soils. So one of the issues with these is that you might just want to monitor that depending on what your water is like. Now I use tap water here in Melbourne because it's actually very clean. One of the things with Phragmipediums though is to just let the water rush out and then put your saucer, maybe just again leave that saucer damp. This one needs to be kept a little moister than its Paphiopedilum cousins, so bear that in mind. None of these are orchids that want to dry out, but particularly the frags. And the grower that I visited over the weekend also recommended about once every 6 months a little bit of garden lime just to maintain the alkalinity of the mix. Otherwise, similar conditions. But now, maybe we should talk about the medium that they're all in. So we can say generally terrestrial. Some of the species types are kind of called lithophytes because they kind of grow in nooks in rocky cliffs, but in that nook there's a lot of medium and it's kept quite moist. So bear that in mind when something is described as a lithophyte, because often you think, oh, it's quite dry and it's going to cling to the side of a rock, but not necessarily. It depends on the conditions, obviously. However, simple rule of thumb is a light, fast draining medium. with an element of something that's going to retain some moisture. So you can use perlite or sphagnum moss, and I use a medium-sized bark and I mix it with sphagnum moss and perlite and charcoal, quite a nice loose mixture, and that enables the water to flow freely, which is what the roots of these plants want, not to retain it too much so that it's soggy, but also not to dry out too quickly. So it's finding that balance. And of course, depends where you are, you might grow it in a completely different way, depends on your climate, but that's what I do. And then with the frags, I do add a little bit of lime, and I also add a little pinch every now and then of coffee grinds, which also adds to the alkaline level of the mix. Now, we mentioned the slowness. This is a seedling that I bought a couple of years ago as well, and I was kind of despairing of it. I thought, oh, you're driving me mad with your slowness, seedling. So I just slung it outside on a lower shelf where it's getting morning sun, and bit of neglect, I have to say, kept it moist, and look, it's actually grown really well. And this is a cross of Paphiopedilum philippinensis, which is a species type, which has multiple blooms actually on the flower spike. So looking forward to that happening. Now, as we're getting into colder weather, I will bring this indoors, but very, very slow. I would suggest, if you have the chance, don't buy seedlings. It's going to take years. If you can, save your money and buy a division or a flowering specimen plant. They are going to be quite a bit more expensive. Here in Australia, they can get up into the hundreds of dollars for a good flowering one. I do think though it's worth it because it can take a long time from seedling to flowering. So bear that in mind. The economy of scale, whether you want something that's blooming straight away or not. I bought this one as a division and it flowered for me pretty quickly. If I'd bought it as a seedling, who knows? Okay, let us move on to the one I showed you at the beginning, which does look, I have to confess, a little dead, but that is because it is a basically herbaceous perennial, and this one is Cypripedium and it's called Philipp. You probably can't read the label. Now, this is a hybrid and it's a cross of various North American species. And one of the things I read about growing these was how difficult it was. Now, we get relatively warm summers here in Melbourne, so I just wasn't sure how it was going to go. And these are really hard to find in Australia too. But I found it from a specialist grower of rare perennials, in fact. And I did lots of reading and I was really frightened. I thought, oh my goodness, I'm never going to get this to grow. So what I've got this growing in, as you can see, it's a terracotta pot, because I am a terracotta pot kind of guy. It also means I can move it around, and I'm just seeing there is a slug on the top of this pot. Oh my goodness, that slug must die. I won't kill it live on camera because you'll all be repulsed, and maybe there's vegans among you. So in its native habitat, it dies down and then gets snowed upon, well, its species ancestor. Obviously, we don't get that here, but as you can see, it's now autumn and the plant is dying down. So the first thing is that this year, and you can see the remains there, it bloomed for me. Now, last year, I got to the flower bud point and we had a tremendous hailstorm and the top of the stem got hit and bent over. And the flower obviously couldn't get more nutrients and died on the stalk. And I was mortified and so disappointed. Had to wait a year, but here we are. I'll drop in some footage of this one from its prime. It was gorgeous, lasts a reasonable amount of time. It's, I think, more for the novelty value though than anything. And then looking after it, it was relatively easy. So the tuber that I got, I just lay on the surface, lightly covered it with a very rich compost. And it has got a fairly rich compost in the pot. It is a woodland plant natively, so a good idea is to cover it with some leaf mulch. So what I did every year, I then cover it with a little bit of leaf mulch, which I will do in autumn. And then on top of that, I put a little sprinkling of an enriched potting mix, which might have dynamic lifter in it or some other fertilizers, and maybe a little bit of animal fertilizer as well mixed into that. So a bit of horse poo if you've got it. Not a huge amount, mix it all together. And then I just put a little layer of that literally over the top of the pot. When the growth has finally died, I just cut it off and then I just leave it in dappled light. It gets dappled morning sun. Imagine it's a woodland plant. It kind of wants that type of light. So not deep shade. It's going to get more light in spring because it comes from deciduous forests. It's going to get more protection in summer, but it's going to die down by autumn anyway. So most of its work is done by then. And there you are. Just looking at that slug, I'm going to say you might want to protect the new shoots from slugs, but I haven't had an issue with this one. I have had slug issues with others, but not with this. So that is Cypripedium. Not an easy plant to find in Australia. Certainly, it's going to need a cool temperate climate if you're trying to grow these, but there are terrestrial Cypripediums from all over the world, and some of them certainly are tropical and subtropical, and others can take incredibly cold temperatures. So if you're interested, I'm sure you'll be able to find something that could work in your environment. So there we are, plant lovers. Thank you, Nina of Ninja Orchids, for organizing this Care Collab video. I'm going to show you this one as a parting gift. This is one that has bloomed for me twice before. This one is now doing the every other year. It's taking 2 years to bloom, but this is one that I'm going to move into more light after my visit to Michael's greenhouses over the weekend. I had hoped that this leaf was going to be the sheath of a flower, but as you can see, it is very much a leaf. There is no indication of a bud in there. So we'll see. I'll put it in a bit more light, not direct light, bright indirect oncidium type light, and we'll see what happens with that. Thank you very much. Do watch everyone else's videos as I will. I'm really excited to see what people are saying and how they're growing their orchids around the world. So from my Duo de Citron in bloom, looking wonderful. Thank you to everyone for watching. Thanks to everyone else for participating. I do post every week on a Friday, so hit subscribe if you want to see what my non-slipper adventure might be next week, and I look forward to seeing you then.